you and welcome back to Let's Talk About Safety podcast. Today we have part 2 of the due diligence and responsibilities of a PCBU officer and worker. We will be speaking again with Alena Titterton, who is a partner of an international law firm with Clyde & Co. and is recognised as one of Australia's leading health, safety and security lawyers. Alena's practice involves in conducting 24/7 incident response and investigation for companies across many industries, including the construction industry. She also develops and reviews safety management systems and due diligence frameworks to help organisations get their systems right before an incident occurs, and provides briefings to senior leadership groups on how to be proactive safety leaders. As I said, today is part 2 of the PCBU officer and worker responsibilities, and I hope you got the chance to listen to part 1 where we unpack Christopher's case. My aim of the 2 podcasts is to ensure that we all understand that it is our responsibility and it is our job to stay safe all the time so that we can go home to our families every single day, because no Australian should ever go to work and die. So please enjoy the next part, and we hope it all makes sense on what our new laws bring to us. Thank you. So going back to what we were discussing when you were saying reasonably practicable, which is all over the WHS law, I'd like to understand this idea of doing what's reasonably practicable, and what does that require an organisation to do when it comes to that?
Really good question. It's a really good question, Patrizia, because I think people get really confused by this concept. Like, they'll bandy around the words, but they don't really know what it means.
It's everywhere. On the whole WHS law, it's reasonably practicable. But people say, well, what's reasonably practicable?
What does it mean?
What is it? Can you explain? What is it?
Yes. Well, the good news is it actually is defined in the legislation as well. One of the places where you'll find that written is in a definition.
But it's still questionable.
It's still hard for people, right? But it's basically like a weighing up assessment. And this is the definition for the purposes of the health and safety duties specifically, right? So it's taking into account weighing up all matters, including the likelihood of a hazard or risk concern occurring, the degree of harm that might result from that hazard or the risk occurring, what the person concerned knows or reasonably to know about that hazard or risk, and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk. And then weighing up those things against the availability of suitable ways to eliminate or minimise the risk. And then, and only then, so it's very last consideration, the cost associated with the way of eliminating or minimising the hazard or risk, including whether it's grossly disproportionate to the risk concerned occurring. Now, when you look at those factors, like, that sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, right? Like, what are we really talking about? Well, when I listen to it, I think what it really is saying is, please, please, please do the proactive health and safety risk management process. You have to be looking at understanding what your hazards and risks are, and then identifying what controls need to be put in place. And you need to try to eliminate that risk first up. Give all of your thought to, how can we make sure this just isn't an issue that arises?
Yes.
And if we can't do that, what are the risk minimization strategies? And you have to adopt the hierarchy of controls in doing that.
Yes.
So you've got to look at substitution, you've got to look at isolation and engineering controls before you look at administrative controls and PPE. And what do I mean by admin controls? That's things like your policies and procedures and that kind of thing, right? And then your personal protective equipment. Now, we know that admin policies, procedures, it's just like you were saying right at the beginning. The piece of paper is not going to save someone, right?
Be human. Put the human factor in this.
Yeah,
that's all we need to do.
Yeah, that's it. And so, like, what is it about how we perform the work, and what can we do, like, in a really active way to make it safe? And the thing is, the regulations are there to help people understand what controls need to be put in place. And it's very much true in the construction sector context more than any other.
I think
because
so.
The regulations are so specific as to what the relevant controls are for those really high risk categories. So whether it's, working with confined spaces, or it's electrical work, or it's working at heights, or it's scaffolding quite expressly. Like there are mandatory risk controls that are set out in the regulations for companies simply to follow. So it's all, it's got to be about how do we have a culture that makes sure those things are actually in place.
I mean, going into that, I mean, it just reminds me of that thought that I had right from the beginning. I mean, I used to make coffee for a living, okay? But I was always interested in construction, always been involved with construction. And I know a fair bit about it, you know what I mean, even before Christopher died. And one thing that I do know was the load limit on a scaffold platform is 675 kilos. Now, I know I'm a coffee person. If a builder, because obviously within the prosecution, the builder was saying, well, we didn't know. We thought we had a 2,000 kilo or 2 ton limit to put onto the platform. That can't be true, because there is no scaffold out there that can hold a 2 ton limit on every level. Now, the scaffold was overloaded by 18 tons, 9 levels, 2 tons on every single level. And we all know that scaffold is there for people and their tools and some material, not all the materials. Now, this was an order done, obviously, by Janellen to load the scaffold because the Alemac was removed. And so they put all of the materials all at once, still in pallets, still wrapped in plastic, on every single level. And now that's a big no-no. Yet I know it's written on paper, it's beautiful, but paper does not save lives. We need to follow those instructions and say, well, no, it's 675 kilos. We got to make sure that, you know, the people are on there, and also the materials don't go over the 675 kilos. And it was blatantly put on there. And it's because of that, that's what gets to me. Because you know you can't do it, yet you go ahead and do it. And this is what I want people to step back and think. Think about what you're doing.
What's really a really key point in what you're saying there, Patrizia, is this idea of how work is designed. So it's not just about the activity on the ground, but it's thinking about the whole planning of the work, so that, you know, do you actually have the right equipment to perform the work safely in the first place, from that full like work design perspective. And those decisions are typically made at the project level, right? At the site level, like, which is taking into account all of the work that's being done by subcontractors across multiple entities. So it's not just that particular aspect of things, it's how things are connected, how they're working together. And so a lot of that obligation is really on that project management team, that site leadership team, to really be thinking about how do we make sure that this is going to work seamlessly and provide, you know, safe systems of work across all of those entities as they're performing their work. So we're not overloading the scaffolding that's really there for the workers' protection. You know, how do we make sure that we have the right equipment so that that doesn't happen?
Yeah.
So, and that's all part of what reasonable practicability is all about. So 100%. It's kind of,
it's knowing
safe work design, you know.
It's the knowledge, and it's a pretty much knowledge that all builders have. And in my case, it's all builders have that knowledge, and workers, they know that there's a limit to what you can do, you know. You know, and also going to what you were saying before about the categories, different categories that we have, because we have a category 1, category 2, and then category 3. Category 1 being the highest prosecution. And, you know, you're mentioning that the builder got category 2 prosecution. So what does that mean in a sense of, can you unpack that? Why? Because in my eyes, it should have been a category 1 right from the beginning. And you know, when it was prosecuted as a category 2, not only me, but probably a lot of people out there questioned why such a horrific incident was classed as a category 2.
Yeah.
You know,
I can fully appreciate that. It makes sense because, you know, just how horrific that incident was, you just, and the various press reports that came out about it post the incident, you know, it looked like a category 1, you know, absolutely.
It was definitely a category 1. And I have no doubt that it should have been a category 1.
And yet I can see that perspective and I get that. And particularly given what you were just talking about, Patrizia, because I think that upstream decision-making stuff around, you know, what equipment you have available and the overloading of the scaffolding is the more important point from the perspective of, you know, whether it was reckless as to risk or not, right? And yet the focus of the conversation in the prosecution, and I think it would have been the focus in the prosecution brief, because that's how the prosecution,
yes,
you know, ended up coming out the way that it does, is all about the scaffolding ties, right?
Yes, and not the overloading. Hello.
Not the overloading. And your point is a really well-made one, because the overloading point is an upstream issue, right? And requires an upstream elimination or substitution, right? So yeah, I can eliminate the risk of overloading because I don't have those materials on there. I have those
plead
materials.
guilty to that. They did plead guilty to overloading.
Yeah, and that formed part of the category 2. But it's interesting because I think if you could play with the elements of the offence in order to kind of get closer to that recklessness piece, if you focus more on the overloading aspect of things rather than the scaffold tie point. But let me kind of, I'm kind of going to unpack it.
Unpack it. Let me understand, because it's not sticking in here to why.
Yeah, and I do get both perspectives here, and I understand why they ended up doing what they ended up doing because of how it played out, right? Okay. In terms of the investigation. But let's start from the perspective of the question you asked me, which is categories of offences. So you've got the duties. We've talked about the duties, right? And there's that primary duty of care of the organisation. There's the officer duty to exercise due diligence. There's the worker duty to take reasonable care. There are corresponding offences for the breach of duty. And those offences are criminal offences, as we've been talking about. It's a criminal regime that's established by the health and safety laws. And you've got these 3 categories of offences that go to the duties of organisations as PCBUs, officers and workers. So the category 1 offence, as you pointed out, is the highest type of offence. So that's why, you know, it's the most egregious type of conduct. And what category 1 offences require is an element of recklessness, or in the context of New South Wales now, there's also an alternative fault element of gross negligence. But that wasn't in place at the time.
That's right.
Of Christopher's incident and at the time of prosecution.
It's because I actually did have that conversation with Kevin, you know what I mean? And
it's a great reform. I'm so glad it's there, because I think it makes that category make more sense now to have both options in there, because gross negligence is a sort of lower standard than that recklessness as to risk, right?
Yes.
But I'll talk about that. But you've got a maximum penalty in category 1s for organisations of $3 million in most jurisdictions, but it's now gone up to $3.8 million for New South Wales companies. And what happens, you've got a category 1 offence when you've got a health and safety duty, and the person without reasonable excuse engages in conduct that exposes an individual to whom that duty is owed to a risk of death or serious injury or illness, and the person is reckless as to that risk, right? And there's also personal ramifications for officers up to, I think it's around about $760,000 for officers now, and also up to 5 years imprisonment for category 1 offences for breaching the officer due diligence obligation. And for workers, if they breach that reasonable care and it's a category 1 and recklessness as to risk, they can see up to $383,000 roundabout in monetary penalties and or 5 years imprisonment as well. So there's a potential for even workers to go to jail. But in the category 2 offences, which this particular charge was, it's having that health and safety duty and failing to comply with that duty and that failure exposes people to risk of death or serious injury or illness without the element of recklessness. And now that gross negligence alternative as well. So maximum penalty of $1.5 million for corporations in most jurisdictions. That's increased now in New South Wales, again, because of recent reforms, to around about the $1.9 million penalty mark. But at the time of the incident involved here, you were looking at a maximum penalty for a Category 2 offence for an organisation of $1.5 million. Now, Category 3 offences are technical breach. So we've got a failure to comply with the duty, but there isn't that risk element. Now, obviously, there was risk of death or serious injury, and in fact, the risk actually eventuated here. You had Christopher, but also one of his fellow colleagues being really seriously hurt as well, right? So you had both the risk of death and the risk of serious injury. And those eventuated. And there was also other workers who were absolutely exposed to risk,
and they're scarred. Scarred for life, because they actually saw the whole thing come down, and two bricklayers were actually on the top. They saved themselves.
It's extraordinary and horrific.
It is.
So those three categories, Category 2 offence here. Why did the prosecutor say Category 2 and not a Category 1? And I think you've really got to talk about, well, what is that recklessness test and what is that gross negligence test to understand and unpack that further. So, gross negligence wasn't on the table then, but it's worth mentioning what it is for people. So gross negligence, what that means is such a great falling short of the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise in the circumstances that it warrants criminal prosecution. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, what would a person with the same knowledge, same experience, same expertise as you do if they were put in those same circumstances? So that's really the gross negligence test. But at the time of this offence, there was only that recklessness test. So if we look at what we're talking about for recklessness, you're reckless as to a circumstance if you're aware of a substantial risk that circumstance exists and will exist, and having regard to those circumstances that are known to you, it's unjustifiable for you to take that risk. And a person, whether it's an organisation or an individual, would also be reckless with respect to a result occurring if they're aware of a substantial risk that result will occur, and having regard to all those circumstances, it's unjustifiable to take that risk. So there's that sort of knowledge and intent sort of element involved in there. So I think let's say they had enough evidence around the point around someone taking the scaffold ties off.
Yes. Which at this stage, no one can find who that did.
Yeah.
But we know about the overloading. So why could not Category 1 be appointed to the overloading factor?
Yeah. So that's really where, so recklessness as a risk, did they know that overload, putting that material on there would cause it to overload? How much questioning and work was done in the prosecution around that point?
But do you question yourself to think, well, we all know that you can't overload more than 675 kilos. A scaffold is not made for material. Scaffold is made for people, and we know that it's a known fact, and it goes back to the due diligence and putting back the reasonable, practicable. It goes back into that because we know that fact. We know that you can't put more than 675 kilos on there, and it shouldn't be material.
But it would be easier for them to establish the Category 2, which is that's a known risk, and the risk has arisen and it has caused that death, right? Everything you just said, every one of those boxes. Whereas the recklessness test, that, knowledge and intent, and that you go ahead anyway, you kind of need something a little more active in terms of.
But it was knowledge and intent. That's what I'm saying. They would know that the scaffold does not hold more than 2 ton on every level, yet they still that intent was still there.
But they need to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, right? And so they'd need some sort of evidence, for example, that someone, let's say there's minutes of a meeting where someone says, hang on, we can't put this material here because of X, Y, Z. And then someone says, don't worry anyway. They'd need a little something to kind of hang their hat on to meet that high bar of recklessness. Yeah. Now, it's interesting because I think, I suspect they were focusing more on the scaffolding ties than the overloading. And this is it's a complete suspicion and, it's conjecture on my part, Patrizia, but just the way the judgment reads, I see so much more focus on the scaffolding tie point.
Ties.
And what's interesting about this, and I think it's important to kind of be able to demonstrate why they might have thought recklessness was too high bar. With those scaffolding ties, once Janellen was told about the problem of the tampering by workers with those scaffolding ties, they did do something about it, right? They did sit down with Synergy to go, we want to put more control measures in place. And putting that control measure in place around increasing the frequency of the inspections means that they weren't reckless as to the risk. They did something about the risk. Now we can have a conversation and debate about whether they did enough. And 100% I agree with you that they didn't do enough. But at the end of the day, they didn't do nothing about that risk.
Yeah.
And carry on anyway. They did put something in place. And that makes it very difficult for the prosecutor to establish recklessness.
Yeah.
Because in the whole scheme of the thing, the risk that arose there had something to do with the fact that it wasn't, tied together. Now, it was both of those factors, but when you take them both together, they didn't do nothing. And the recklessness piece kind of requires, it requires sort of active, we're going ahead with performing work in an unsafe manner, and we're doing it anyway. So if you look at the only Category 1 prosecution that's been successful in New South Wales today, in that Cadar Lime Products case, you had proof and evidence that the regulator had around having gone out to that mine site for years and years. So there were like improvement notices and prohibition notices on the electrical work and faults at the mine electrically. 2007, 2009, 2013. And then you have the incident where...
So it's very foreseeable.
Super foreseeable. And also like the regulator is literally the one telling them, you haven't got this under control. And then after they've got those notices, they've then gone and got a worker without an electrical qualification to do the work on the switchboard. So you can see how that's a different, a different kettle of fish,
It's purely reckless.
Like you can really see it, right? And like there's notices that kind of happen along the way. There was another case involving another construction company and where their scaffolding was too close to the power lines. And this is the I don't know if you've seen this one, but the prosecution involving WGA Proprietary Limited. And they had an inspector turn up and issue notices, prohibition notices, saying, hey, like you've designed, and this was, if you talk about the upstream issue, they designed the building to take up too much of the land so that it was too close during the build, right? So, and basically the inspector was like, what if a worker is carrying a pole, a piece of scaffold?
That's right.
Going to hit that power line, and said you can't do any more work here until you've worked with the electricity company around what to do about it. And it turned out that they could only do de-energization of the power lines in order to make work there safe. So it had to be done work de-energized. The director of this company wrote to the inspector saying, I promise no work will be done on this without the work being without the power lines being de-energized. And guess what he did? He wanted the scaffold come down at a particular time frame, and he didn't want the scaffold to stay up because that was going to be a bit more money, wasn't it?
Yes.
So the scaffold to come down. So he asked the guy who was doing work on the windows to come and do the work, and he had never done high-rise residential construction before. He was a guy who used to do houses. And so he wasn't as aware of the hazards and risks involved in the work. And of course, you know, he got an electric shock. You know, so, and that, interestingly, that was also a Category 2 prosecution. I reckon that one definitely could have been a Category 1 because, again, you've got those sort of notices,
yes,
and you're literally being told about the hazard and risk, exactly how it might arise, and almost precisely that is what happened. So I would have been prosecuting that particular individual officer for a Category 1 breach of officer due diligence on top of the entity. But I think the regulators have wanted to make sure and because they want to make sure they're successful in their prosecutions, sometimes they don't want to take that risk of putting it up to that higher standard where they've got.
And I think that's what happened to our case. It's not going to that risk of what if we don't win this case. And, you know, it's pretty sad that it wasn't taken further. You know what I mean? I believe it should have done it.
Because, Patrizia, I'm personally interested to hear from you about this. Would you have preferred if the regulator took it as a Category 1 prosecution and failed to get a conviction? Or do you prefer that they got a conviction?
Well, you know, I still think they should have gone all the way. I reckon they should have.
Even if they would have lost.
Well, it would have. It more would have come out in the sense of actually getting that investigation done properly. You know what I mean? And not only just focusing on the time, because Janelle did plead guilty to the overloading. You know, and it's there. You know what I mean? And there is also emails saying from other subcontractors to say don't put the materials on there because it's too dangerous. Yet they still went ahead and did it. So that's reckless for me. That's still being reckless. Even though a subcontractor said don't do it because it's too dangerous, they still went ahead and did it. Okay, so where does that come with? Why are they reckless about that? Why are they, you know, that should have been taken further. And it wasn't because the focus was on the ties. You know,
I mean, I think a few different things. And the other thing to mention that we're probably not giving enough credit to is that I do think GN, before they were prosecuted, actually said to the regulator, if you charge us with this kind of offence, we will plead guilty. So
exactly. But that's a backroom type of deal with the devil type thing, you know what I mean? That's the way I see it. It's kind of, well, you know, let's not go that far because we're just going to stretch this out for too long. Let's just go for the easy way and go for Category 2 and we'll plead guilty.
Well, that's also interesting that you see it as a, like, we don't want to stretch it out too long, you know, in a kind of like inconvenience for the company thing, because the way in which the courts actually think about that is it's better for the community if it's not stretched out, and it's better for victims and families if it's
I agree with that.
So companies, and this happened in this prosecution, if we're talking about the penalty here, when they plead guilty early, they get a discount on the penalty that's ultimately imposed, and it's called the utilitarian benefit of an early guilty plea. So not dragging people through the mud, because if you do have a defense of a prosecution, then every single person is going to have to give evidence in the witness box, you know, and everyone is going to be re-traumatized who was at the site at the time, you know. So there's a 25% discount on the penalty, and they got the 25% discount here because they did do an early guilty plea. So it was meant to be 1.2 million, but
you can still do an early guilty plea on Category 1.
Yeah, but they wouldn't have. I don't think. Well, look again, conjecture, conjecture. but I suspect that it's the kind of weighing up assessment around the risk to a prosecutor of failing to get that conviction, because there's the potential risk, right? When the penalty is so much higher, and particularly if an individual was going to be prosecuted in a category 1, this is even more true, I think, because you've got the potential for jail time, right? If you've got the potential for jail time, any criminal lawyer would tell you, defend it, like, make the prosecutor work for it. Why would you just agree to go to jail? So, I think there is this kind of risk factor for prosecutors around category 1. And the other thing to point out is that they have never, in this jurisdiction, they have never had a defense.
Are we too soft?
Well,
are we too soft? This is what I believe. We're too soft. There's no precedent. There's no precedent in New South Wales.
I think regulators need to go for category 1 prosecutions. Yes. But the thing I would say to that is that we have to expect in the first category 1 prosecutions that a safety regulator does, because it's a new type of thing for them, they may fail a few times. They won't win every time. This idea of getting a conviction absolutely every time is actually not good for the health and safety messages that we're trying to get. And so it's less about not being soft enough, and I think it's more about being courageous and being bold to make the case law, to help people understand what these laws actually mean. So,
but that's what I was pushing for.
Yeah,
I was pushing for that. Fight it.
But if you fight it and you lose,
but we fought it.
It's.
I know that, but we fought it. See, for me, it was setting a precedent. Okay, now Christopher's case is one of the largest cases that Safe Work New South Wales has taken on. Okay,
prosecution brief,
it's huge. It's the files is it's probably 4 times more than a normal prosecution. Okay, you've got information there that I'm sure was taken out, and agreements was done in the back room to say, well, let's just let's not drag this on for too long. Let's just go for category 2. You plead guilty, and we finish at that.
And I mean,
where's the precedent here?
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
I do think we need judgments that give more guidance to the whole community about what these things mean. But I do think if they're going to take category 1 offences, we all need to be prepared that they're going to lose sometimes. Like, they're not going to win every time. And I think they just didn't want to lose for you, apart from anything else, like. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I know, but it doesn't set that precedent. That's what I wanted with Christopher's case. You have the largest case now in front of you. Don't chicken out now. Don't chicken out on me now. Whatever the situation, justice will never be served for my son. I know that, okay? Doesn't matter if it was category 1 or category 2, whatever it was, okay? Because my son should never have gone to work and died.
Exactly.
Okay, that's the overarching thing here that I discussed. But knowing that New South Wales has never gotten to a category 1, and our laws, there's only one, but only recently. And
that one is 2018, so it's a few years ago. But with that one, they pled guilty to the category 1 offence.
Yes,
it wasn't. They didn't have
because it was cut. It was so. That's right, and that's something that is fine. But it's just, I don't know. It's just the way. I wasn't the only one in shock when I heard it was category 2. I wasn't the only one thinking, what? What do you mean? How can this not be a category 1 offence? And a lot of people question that, not just me. And this is why I need it unpacked to understand why it wasn't category 1. And I'm not here to put people in jail. I'm not here I don't want people to go to jail, and I just want Christopher's death not to be in vain.
Yeah.
And to set that precedent, and to make PCBU's officers and workers understand of their responsibilities that they have within the workspace. And I'm not talking just construction. I'm talking about every workplace. Every workplace, not just construction. No
100%.
Australian should go to work and die, because these measures are put in place for a reason.
Yeah.
And, our penalties aren't high enough.
Oh, I completely agree with you. But before I talk about penalties, because there's a world of things to talk about in penalties, but I actually think what you have done with the work that you do with education and awareness on construction sites has done far more than any case precedent ever would do. Like, the work that you've done to change people's hearts and minds is so massive. And, I thank you for that contribution that you make, because honestly, it does more than any judgment in any court will do.
But that's because I do that in honor of my son. You know what I mean? I just believe what happened should never have happened. And it's because of the not having the penalties, not having those precedents in place where PCBUs think, well, why would I care? What's $900,000? Do you know what I mean? What's that? It's nothing. It's peanuts. So that will put the risks in place, because it's really not a massive penalty. And that's what I'm trying to change, and I wanted Christopher's case to be a precedent for every single PCBU officer and worker to understand we all have responsibilities.
So you would have liked to have seen personal prosecutions as well as the organisational prosecution?
I wanted to be unpacked. I wanted to be unpacked to actually act as a precedent. I can't bring my son back. I cannot bring my son back, okay? There's nothing I can do to bring him back, and no justice will ever give him that justice of going to work and dying. I'm being proactive. I don't want what happened to Christopher to happen again to anybody. And that is why I'm here, and that's why I fight. That's why I'm constantly doing my talks, because we need to be proactive together as one. Yeah. Government, unions, workers, builders, workplace, everybody needs to be together, and safety needs to be the overarching factor here. Well, safety of human life. Yeah. We all have the human life overrides everything.
Yeah, exactly. And we should all be on mind about that.
Oh, and that's what I'm here for, and that's what I do. That's what Let's Talk About Safety is all about. As I said, I can't bring my son back. There's nothing I can do. And no justice will ever fix that. But it's the precedent, and this is what I wanted. I wanted that precedent. I want the penalties to be changed. I want, the Minister Kevin Anderson has done a few things to the law to change it, to add those things so that any future incidents that do happen are easier to prosecute. And he's with the negligence and reckless behaviour in Category 1, it's much easier without having that proof, because a person doesn't have to die or get injured to be prosecuted. Okay, so a worker...
It's been the case that's been possible, right? That's always lived there in Category 2, like the risk of death.
The risk of death. But it's been put up onto Category 1.
But now we've got both that recklessness and the gross negligence. And you've also got higher penalties being put in. But, I mean, just talking to that penalties point, I think the main reform that we still haven't seen that would be the critical thing for getting higher penalties really is about getting penalties and sentences guidelines to the courts so that we can get better consistency in the penalties being handed down.
Yes.
And that there's actually a link. It's interesting. In the UK, they've actually had an experience where they were suffering from the same problem of a lack of consistency and pretty low penalties being handed down in these kinds of cases. So they actually introduced these penalties and sentences guidelines. And one of the things that guideline in the UK does is it links the penalty, kind of bans it in terms of, the risk category and the seriousness of the offence and the
matching the crime, the penalty matching the crime. Yeah.
But then on top of that, it also says, what is the annual turnover of that business that's being prosecuted,
yes.
and let's make the penalty match the type of organisation so that
percentage
it's real to them as a risk factor, as opposed to it being a small thing for a large business. And that's a really interesting innovation. And what it did do is the penalties went up because there was consistency and it was banded as to what was meant. So there were, formulas that people could use when handing down sentences. And I think we need that kind of.
And I did put this forward to the minister, Kevin Anderson. And I said to him, I understand you don't want to put a $16.1 million fine in a category 1 for a PCBU or a director of a company that only makes $3 million a year.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I understand that. And we need to have that in place where there's that percentage. And it goes by, we have penalty units. Let's use those penalty units compared to the PCBU and the size of the PCBU that is involved, and put the penalties accordingly. Have the penalties accordingly that match the crime as well. Do you know what I mean? And, you can't charge $16.1 million on someone that's turning over $3 million. Do you know what I mean? And I fully understand that. And I did put this forward to the ministers. And when I said that the laws need to change, they need to be clearer. We need clearer, precise laws that prosecutors can understand and prosecute properly with.
I personally think that the primary duty and the elements of the offence are really clear. My real issue is, how do we translate that into different types of incidents and support regulators with understanding what they need to do in an investigation? Yes. And what that may require is, it may require the prosecutors at the end of the process to be involved earlier in the investigation to support them with, this is what you need. Have you ticked every single box across? Because often I think, the inspector will do their investigation, they'll wrap it up, and then they'll give it to the prosecutor, just a few months away from the limitation period being up. And then there's holes in what is required.
That's
from a legal perspective, right? And you've only got a certain amount of time to fix those holes at that point. Maybe it's a problem from an independence perspective, I'm not sure, but I suspect there needs to be more involvement earlier on. It's a safety in design issue in the 100%. Investigation.
And I 100% agree with that. You know what I mean? It needs to be done together as a collaborative thing, so that, even the prosecutor can understand what they're prosecuting.
Yeah.
And why. And be there. Yeah. And see it, and put something around it. I just know that with a penalty that was handed down to Janelle for Christopher's death was $900,000, and it was, for me personally, too low. Why do you think it was that low? Why didn't it? I know that the 25% discount was a big factor here, and we know that it was category 2.
1.2 was imposed, and the maximum that was possible, because it was category 2, is 1.5. So it was only $300,000 off the maximum.
Yeah.
So in the scheme of like the full, range of $0 to 1.5, the judge has decided it's closer to the top end. It's not the worst, but it's pretty close to the top end of this category of offence. And I do think what's interesting, because this judge, has issued a number of different penalties. So like, if you just compare this, for example, so the category 1 offence that I spoke about before, that's the only successful category 1. Do you know what the penalty was there?
1.3, I think. 1.2.
You're right. It was 1.2, but it was 900,000 because of an early guilty plea. So they got the 25% discount as well, right? So $900,000 off what was then maximum penalty of $3 million.
Yeah.
Right. So for the category 1, most serious type of offence, a 900,000 off a maximum of $3 million. So it was like in the bottom third.
Yeah.
Like you might have ended up with the same kind of, if it had gone to a category 1 prosecution, you may have ended up with the same penalty being imposed or not much different.
Yes.
Like if we look at the Cadar Lime products example and try and compare the two cases. I mean, I think what happened in Cadar Lime products is really, really bad. I mean, it should have been way higher, right?
Yeah.
But, that's what happened in the first category 1. And then you look also at the compare the prosecution penalty in that WGA case that I was talking about before. So that was a category 2 as well. And they received $1 million penalty off a 1.5 maximum. Right? So, and they didn't get the discount for because they didn't do the early guilty plea piece. But, it's interesting because that, I think that case is worse in terms of the conduct, right?
Of approving the proof behind it.
Exactly. Like if you're looking at what the judgments talk about, like let's just like put it, the judgments next to each other and the prosecution judgment. You look at the WGA piece and you've literally got a director telling an inspector they're not going to do something and then they go and do it.
Yes.
Right? Like that is really bad, really, really, really bad. You've literally been told that. So you've got a $1 million penalty there. Here, you had a $1.2 million penalty. And interestingly, same judge.
Yeah.
So like taking out that discount piece, he actually made a higher penalty on GN than he did WGA in this case. And I think what that shows is that judges are starting to increase penalties.
Yeah.
And we are starting to see more $1.2 million penalties being handed down. But you're not going to see penalties increasing unless you get those penalties guidelines and unless you increase the penalties in these categories of offences. Like, I mean, the industrial manslaughter conversation we haven't got into yet, but that's where the big penalties conversation has kind of ended up, right? We'll put a massive penalty if someone dies, and it's based on the consequence of someone dying rather than the risk to health and safety. That's kind of the basis of the industrial manslaughter offence philosophy, right? And $10 million penalties or $16 million penalties, whatever different jurisdictions have wanted to do, and they've decided to do different things as well from a company perspective, and then having the 20 years or 25 years imprisonment for senior leaders who are charged with industrial manslaughter. But, I actually think you would do better if you if the idea of the community is we don't think these penalties are high enough, we don't think 1.5 million or $3 million is enough, or why aren't we putting the $10 million in a category 1 offence?
That's ideally what I'd like. I know that the government doesn't want to call it industrial manslaughter, but don't call it anything. Just it's still category 1 WHS law with a higher penalty. Yeah. The consequence is there. The consequence is there.
You got the recklessness piece, you got the gross negligence piece. Like,
just increase the penalty to match the crime, and allow that being able to increase those penalties according to what happened.
According to what happened and according to the scale of the organisation and what they do, I think those things would be, that makes sense to me. You and I have had many conversations over time about industrial manslaughter. I just think industrial manslaughter takes us away from like what the legal regime is about.
But I think it's putting a title to it because people can understand. It's not a criminal act as such that I've gone out and got a gun and shot someone. That's what the community understands criminal acts to be. You have gone out and specifically gone and killed someone. A director does not do that. A director does not intentionally go out to kill someone, and this is why I think industrial manslaughter gives it that title of different. It is in a way a criminal act, but it's industrial manslaughter because you killed someone in the act of doing something that you shouldn't have done. Not intentionally, it could be intentionally and non-intentionally, but you haven't physically had the thought of, I'm going to kill someone today, And I think that's where the separation of that might be.
I don't know. For me, we just the difficulty I have is that I'm doing the work all day, every day.
Yes, and of course,
with organisations, and the thing that I get scared about with the industrial manslaughter conversation is that, I do officer due diligence briefings, and I have to tell people what's going on in legal developments around the country, and I now have to spend 10, 15 minutes of those briefings at least talking about all of the different ways industrial manslaughter has been done, because it's been done differently in Queensland.
I know.
WA's giving us 2 completely different classes of the thing. Like everyone's doing it so different. Victoria's got a different approach too. They're different duty holders in the different jurisdictions. They're different penalties in the different jurisdictions, and they're different standards.
Where's the harmonisation in that?
It's all ridiculous. But the thing that I find really sad about that is that that's taking 15 minutes away from me being able to teach them about critical risk control, about how we actually go about keeping people safe day to day, practically on the ground, because I'm telling them about industrial manslaughter. And anytime you have like the potential for 25 years imprisonment on the table, all of a sudden the conversation is more about managing legal liability risk and the legal liability strategies that are having to be deployed. And when you've got that potential, now individual officers, individual workers and organisations all need to be separately legally represented, because there's conflicts of interest going crazy where it didn't used to look like that when it was a risk-based regime. And so now, like, there's 50,000 lawyers in the room, and what happens when there's lots of lawyers around? Nothing good. I can say that, I'm one.
Too many disagreements.
And it's basically everyone telling everybody else to shut up and don't say anything. And what does that mean for safety? It means that we're not sharing lessons as much anymore, because there's too much of a fear factor of what could happen to that individual organisation or that individual person from a legal perspective. So they don't say anything. They don't share amongst themselves. And
which is so important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
so important.
We need the sharing. And so I'm scared that industrial manslaughter is going to take us backwards, because it's based on consequence rather than being based on how do we prevent risk. And while ever we're having that be proactive about risk management conversation, it's closer to making sure people stay safe day to day.
Yes.
That's my. No. I'm quite passionate about it for that reason.
I know. And the way I see it is that I look at other builders or other PCBUs looking at my case and thinking, well, what's $900,000 to me? What does that mean to me? If I had a bigger penalty, a high penalty, high consequence, and the risk, the actual being jailed for doing what I did, it would be more of a deterrent.
Yeah,
it needs to act as a deterrent.
And here's my answer to that. I actually think there are better solutions for it. it's, instead of calling it industrial manslaughter, having a higher penalty for category 1 offences, whether you're a PCBU or you're an officer or you're a worker, that is the answer, because that is still in that risk-based regime. And then secondly, actually prosecuting category 1 individual offences in addition to PCBU offences, where it is in that, you know, kind of category that you should. We need to see more of it. And I think a lot of the officer prosecutions to date have been of officers who are really close to doing the work, like they're working directors in the businesses, right? Like, so, you know, it'll be a director who was the one, you know, operating the forklift involved in the incident. That's when you get an officer due diligence prosecution. And that's not the point of the officer due diligence obligation. It's meant to be about senior leadership. But how many prosecutions of senior leaders in, you know, organisations where you're really looking at the decision making are happening? I don't think regulators have really got their heads around how officer due diligence works properly to feel confident to take those kinds of cases. It's always the solo director who's really close and in a small to medium enterprise. And we need to, it comes back to that idea of courage and being bold and not being afraid to lose some prosecutions whilst you're making the early case law on something.
You know, and it's taking that. I mean, you've got to, I just, it's too soft. And going back to that, we're just too soft. And there's that, it doesn't act as precedent. It doesn't act as a you know, as a deterrent. It doesn't, there's not enough oomph in it.
Yeah, we need some courage.
We need, you know,
courage education.
100%. 100%.
They're the things I think we need.
The penalties need to be increased. You know, I mean, I know Minister Kevin Anderson doesn't believe that the penalties should be increased, and that he feels that changing, you know, the category 1 by adding the negligence and reckless in there is enough of a proactive measure. And I agree. There's enough proactive measure and consequence put in there into the category 1. But the penalty does not match the crime. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Category 1 penalties should go higher. I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that.
100%. You know,
there's always a place where we have
it is. Well, you know, I mean, the bill's been put forward in government, you know what I mean, to try and get industrial manslaughter. And as I said, it doesn't have to be called industrial manslaughter. Just please put those penalties up. That's what I'm pleading for. You know, don't call it industrial manslaughter, but we've got to match the crime, and they've got to be done properly.
And I also think it's really important for, you know, the standard, whatever the standard is that we decide as a community that we're looking for. And I think that should be a public conversation, and you do amazing work to keep it a part of the public discourse. But whatever it is we decide, it should be standard across the country.
Oh, 100%. That's another thing I'll be working on, trust me.
You know,
how many businesses
doing business, you know?
Yeah, well, how many businesses do we have that that work in different states?
Yeah.
And they have to deal with different regulations, different laws. It should be one. Australia is one. You know, make the WHS law the same. You know, if I own a business in Victoria, I'm governed by 2 different laws. You know, and it's ridiculous. You know, it's just common sense. It is common sense to and you know, going back to the Murray Boland report, just, you know, harmonizing means harmonizing everything, not just bits here and there. Everything. Let's be equal. Let's do everything the same.
The integrity of it over
100%,
time.
100%.
Like, oh, we want everyone to harmonize, but to us. Well, that's not how it's going to work, you know.
And in saying that, obviously, you know, it's we just got to make sure that, you know, in wrapping this up, is to making sure that everybody understands that we're all responsible.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter if you're just a worker and if you're just employed. Have the courage to say no. Say no to an unsafe work practices. Don't ever go past unsafe situation and say it's not my job, because it is your job. It's you. You need to take that responsibility to say no as well, and take that courage in-house to go to your management and say, I will not take this on because it is my responsibility. And if something does happen, I am liable. And that's what I want this message to come across. So I thank you so much, Alena, for being on here and unpacking, my doubts, and, trying to figure out how on earth this law works, as much as, I've taken on that certificate for. Yes, and that's another reason why I took certificate 4 in WHS, because I need to understand what on earth are we dealing with, you know what I mean? And when I hear that some PCBUs don't understand the law, well, they should.
Yeah,
some officers need to understand the law. It should be a requirement. Before you take on.
If officers aren't actually getting that knowledge, they're breaching their officer due diligence obligation. Yeah. It is a personal proactive duty. It's literally written in there that they've got to acquire WHS knowledge. So any officers who are listening, educate yourself, or,
100%.
Talk to people who know about the officer due diligence obligation and can help you with it. I promise I don't actually get any, royalties out of this, and I wasn't going to do this. It just occurred to me now. I've got a couple of books here from Michael Toomer, but he's literally written a very short book. It's tiny.
Yes.
It's from the due diligence series. It's called Duty of Officers. This one is the one for officers to read. There is a similar one. You'll love this, Patrizia, if you haven't seen it already. There's a similar one on the worker duty.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and the series has about 5 or 6 books in it, and one of them's on officers, one's on the PCBU obligation, one's on the worker obligation. There's one on consultations, so working with unions. There's one on investigations as well. So excellent. They're all like 100 pages each. You can read them in an hour. They're written for like real people in a way that
in layman's terms.
Not lawyers who, love lots of words that are unnecessary.
That's fantastic. That's actually fantastic.
But I highly recommend this series as a really practical series. So I'll send you a link, and you can send that to people as well if that's helpful.
100%. And as I said before in the discussion, I'm not here because I want people to go to jail. I am not here. I just want people to start being proactive and taking on people like yourself to find out what is my due diligence and what does it mean to me. Like people like yourself to go out there and making PCBU's officers understand what their due diligence is and taking that on. Like everybody should take that on. We need to all be proactive. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrizia.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Alena, for part 2 of the unpacking Christopher's case and also the responsibilities of a PCBU officer and worker. And it's my pleasure to have you on my podcast, and hopefully we get to speak again for maybe another podcast that might be in the future on a different topic. But thank you everyone for listening.